In 1993, a quiet Midwestern city faced two disappearances that occurred not at the same moment, but in unsettling succession. First, a child vanished without warning from an ordinary morning routine. A few months later, in a different part of the same city, another child slipped from view under circumstances just as silent and untraceable. What could allow two children to disappear from the same community without leaving behind a single answer? In the autumn of 1993, Ridgeton was the kind of small Colorado town where the rhythm of daily life rarely shifted. Most families had lived there for decades, and the landscape of pine trees, quiet roads, and modest wooden houses created an atmosphere in which parents felt comfortable letting their children play outside without constant supervision. The Ridgway family was one of those long-established households. Jack Ridgway, 37, worked as a small engine mechanic out of a converted garage beside his home. He was known for being dependable, slow to speak, and precise with anything that involved tools. His wife, Nora, 34, worked part-time at a local grocery, a woman whose routine seldom changed, and whose movements seemed shaped by years of practicality. Their only child, 4-year-old Mason Ridgway, was a cheerful boy with a round face, thin brown hair that never stayed in place, and a habit of holding his small red toy car in his right hand wherever he went. He spoke softly, often mixing words together, and usually preferred to play in the front yard where he could see his father through the open garage door. On the afternoon of October 18, 1993, nothing at first appeared unusual. According to Nora's later statement, she returned home slightly earlier than planned after finishing a short shift. It was a mild day, the kind of weather that encouraged parents to let children spend time outdoors. She allowed Mason to stay in the front yard, only a short distance from the porch. Jack was in the garage sorting tools and checking the intake manifold of a lawnmower someone had dropped off that morning. He had the garage radio playing at low volume, and he later confirmed he could hear Mason's footsteps in the gravel as the child ran small circles around his toy car. At approximately 4:12 p.m., a neighbor, Mrs. Sylvia Carter, walked past the Ridgway property and saw Mason sitting near a pile of fallen leaves. She had known the child long enough to recognize his small red car and gave a brief wave toward him. Mason looked up, lifted the toy for a moment, then returned to his play. This observation would become one of the last uncontested sightings of the boy. The timeline that followed would later be reconstructed carefully by investigators, based on Nora's testimony, Jack's account, and the neighbor's statements. At some point between 4:15 and 4:20 p.m., Nora briefly stepped inside to warm a plate of leftover pastry. According to her, it was the kind of action she had taken many afternoons before. She expected to call Mason into the kitchen within a few minutes, and she did not sense that anything around her house was unusual. Jack remained in the garage, sorting hardware into drawers, and believed he could hear distant movement outside, but did not pay close attention, assuming it was Mason continuing to play. At around 4:25 p.m., Nora opened the door and called out to her son. She recalled hearing only the wind moving through the leaves and the faint hum of Jack's radio. When she stepped closer to the yard, she saw Mason's red toy car on the ground near the porch steps. It lay in a position that suggested he had set it down rather than dropped it, a detail she later emphasized. She called his name again, louder this time. There was no answer. Her first assumption was that Mason had wandered to the side of the house, toward the small patch of trees, where he occasionally liked to collect pine cones. She walked that direction, calling his name, expecting him to appear from behind a trunk or shrub. When she did not see him, she returned to the garage and asked Jack if Mason had gone inside. Jack looked up, surprised, and said he had not seen the boy leave the yard. He stepped out immediately, scanning the driveway, the sidewalk, and the space near the fence. What followed in the next 10 minutes was a progression from mild confusion to a steady, quiet alarm. The Ridgways checked behind the garage, under the porch steps, and along the side path toward the back gate. They walked out to the street, looked both ways, and asked the nearest neighbor, Mrs. Carter, whether she had seen Mason. She replied that she had seen him earlier, just after 4, but not since then. Nora recalled a sinking sensation at that point, describing it later as something going still inside the air, though she could not explain exactly what she meant. The first irregular statement in the early minutes came from a child in the Carter household, a girl aged 7. She told her mother, and later investigators, that she thought she saw a person crouching near Mason earlier that afternoon, possibly talking to him. However, she could neither describe the clothes nor the face, nor even determine whether the figure was a man or woman. Her account remained vague and unreliable, but in the absence of other clear leads, it was recorded as a potential point of interest. By 4:40 p.m., the Ridgways expanded their search to the adjacent properties, walking along the ditch behind the house and the gravel road leading toward the main road. They called out repeatedly, receiving no response. There was no sign of disturbance, no scattered leaves, no broken branches, no dropped clothing. Mason's toy car remained the only tangible item on the ground, positioned as though he had simply paused and set it aside. At 4:55 p.m., Nora called the local sheriff's office. She spoke in a steady but strained tone, according to the dispatcher's notes, explaining that her son had disappeared from the front yard in the span of only a few minutes. Deputy Frank Mallory was dispatched to the location shortly afterward. When he arrived, he began the routine inquiry, establishing exact timelines, identifying last witnesses, marking the yard perimeter, and checking for footprints that might differ from the child's. The ground, however, was hard and dry. No impressions were clear. Mallory recorded the case in his report as sudden disappearance within immediate home vicinity, no observed disturbance, no identified direction of travel. As dusk approached and volunteers from the neighborhood joined the search, the sense of order in the Ridgway routine had fully broken. Yet even in those early hours, there was still a common assumption among neighbors that a 4-year-old could not simply vanish from a yard that quickly, and that he would be found in some nearby location. But he was not. And from that afternoon onward, no confirmed sighting of Mason Ridgway was ever recorded again. By early spring of 1994, Ridgeton had returned to its slow morning routines. Parents walked their children to school, delivery trucks made their usual rounds, and the Maple Glen apartment complex carried the quiet rhythm of a community that began its day early. The disappearance of Mason Ridgway 8 months earlier lingered only as a cautionary memory, something spoken of in lowered voices, but not expected to repeat. For many, it had become a strange tragedy from last year, not a daily threat. Danielle Rivers brought Evan downstairs shortly after 8:30. It was part of her routine to let him burn off his early morning energy before breakfast. He was a gentle, predictable boy who found comfort in repeating familiar patterns. That morning, he carried a red toy dump truck he rarely let out of his sight. The sandbox, still untouched from the previous day's rain, held a smooth surface that Evan immediately began reshaping with quiet concentration. Danielle settled on the bench nearby, close enough to touch him if she reached out her hand. Nothing disrupted that small circle of peace until the maintenance worker approached to ask whether any notices had come from the building office about an upcoming repair. Their conversation was brief enough that both would later recount it word for word. Simple, practical, without interruption. Throughout it, Evan remained visible, bent over the sand as he pushed the truck in slow, methodical lines. But when the worker walked away and Danielle turned back, A faint, unnatural stillness replaced the ordinary scene. Evan was no longer crouched in the sand. Only the red truck remained, half tilted near the edge of the box as though it had been released mid-motion. For a moment she believed he had wandered behind the hedges, as he sometimes did when he found a leaf or insect to inspect. Calling his name felt routine at first, not alarming. The courtyard answered with silence. It was the wrong kind of silence, too complete, too immediate, too separate from the life that had filled the space just moments before. Danielle moved faster, circling the playground, checking behind the hedges, scanning the walkway, then stepping toward the stairwell as her voice rose in timbre and pitch. Residents began noticing the shift long before realizing what it meant. An older woman watering plants on her second-floor balcony leaned forward, puzzled by the sudden urgency. By the time the maintenance worker rushed back, Danielle's search had widened into instinct rather than logic. She retraced steps she knew Evan couldn't have taken alone, calling out again and again, her voice cutting through the quiet morning. Yet nothing stirred. No rustle, no small cry, no footsteps moving away. Deputy Frank Mallory arrived minutes after the 911 call, and his first observation was how controlled the environment was. Morning disappearances, unlike nighttime cases, usually came with movement. Someone loading a car, someone leaving for work, someone walking a dog. Here, the courtyard lay exposed on all sides, offering little opportunity for unseen approach. Mallory began reconstructing the sequence with patience, shaped by years of methodical work. Danielle repeated every detail she could recall. The older resident from the balcony described the scene with unusual clarity. The boy playing quietly, the mother nearby, the absence of strangers. A subtle disturbance in the sand caught Mallory's attention. It wasn't a footprint or drag mark, just a faint smoothing of the surface, as if something had brushed across it lightly. The trail ended abruptly before reaching the walkway, raising more questions than answers. In cases involving toddlers, movement usually left some physical trace. Here, the trail vanished almost as suddenly as the child. Canine units arrived before 10. The dogs moved in slow circles, noses tracking Evan's scent from the sandbox outward. And then, without any apparent reason, they stopped. The trail collapsed within a radius too small to make practical sense. The same anomaly had occurred in the Ridgway case, and Mallory felt the weight of that pattern as he wrote his notes. 2 children under 5, both disappearing in narrow windows of time, both leaving behind scent trails that ended not in distance, but in nothingness. Residents gathered cautiously at the edges of the courtyard. Some whispered theories based on what they remembered from the previous case. Others insisted they had seen a man near the east gate earlier that morning, though their descriptions contradicted one another. A blue jacket or brown, tall or average height, carrying a bag or empty-handed. The inconsistencies made the details nearly useless. Officers worked through stairwells, utility rooms, dumpsters, and the narrow path behind the complex that led toward an old drainage canal. Nothing appeared disturbed. No piece of clothing lay discarded. No marks suggested resistance or panic. Parents arriving later in the morning pulled their children indoors, the earlier calm replaced by a subdued unease. By early afternoon, the courtyard had been taped off. Danielle remained seated on the bench near the sandbox, her gaze locked on the red truck, as if the toy might still hold the missing link. Officers asked whether she wished to go inside to rest, but she refused. She repeated the same sentence with quiet, controlled disbelief. "He was right there. I didn't hear anything." That detail, nothing heard, nothing seen, became the hinge of the case. Evan was old enough to cry out if startled, and the courtyard carried sound easily. Even a car door closing would have echoed. Yet in the minute or two when Danielle's attention shifted, the world around her remained unnaturally quiet. When Mallory finished his preliminary report near dusk, it contained a simple but chilling observation. The disappearance had occurred in less than 90 seconds, without struggle, without witnesses, and without a single viable direction of travel. 8 months earlier, the Ridgway family had faced that same sentence. And now, with Evan's disappearance, the notion of coincidence began to lose ground in Ridgeton. For several weeks after Evan Rivers vanished, Ridgeton lived in a kind of suspended tension, as if the town itself waited for a misstep from whoever, or whatever, had taken him. The police presence remained heavy at first, patrol cars circling the apartment complex and nearby roads at intervals so frequent that residents could predict the sweep by sound alone. But as the summer deepened, the rhythm changed. Officers stopped lingering near the courtyard. Search grids shrank. Interviews tapered off. The urgency that once animated the community drained quietly into routine. Deputy Mallory reread his notes often, not because they contained answers, but because they contained the absence of them. 2 children disappearing in nearly identical conditions would normally ignite statewide alarms, yet the cases, when stripped to their facts, failed to provide footholds. No fingerprints, no reliable witness statements, no pattern of suspicious vehicles, no ransom attempt, no boundary crossed or broken. In each disappearance, the world behaved normally before and normally after, but never during. Summer turned to fall, and the Rivers family learned to move around a hollow that no longer closed. Evan's mother stopped walking through the courtyard. His father avoided the bench entirely. Neighbors, well-meaning at first, gradually shifted into silence, unsure whether condolences helped or harmed. And by the time the year closed, most residents no longer spoke of the case unless prompted, as though the memory of the courtyard might reopen something too fragile to bear. Mallory, however, continued working past the point where procedure allowed. He initiated a re-interview of every resident in the building, searching for discrepancies in early statements. There were none. He ran background checks on maintenance staff, delivery workers, contractors, anyone present that morning. All came back clean. He revisited the drainage canal, walking the length of it alone after dusk, listening for anything that contradicted the silence that had defined both disappearances. Nothing did. Then came the winter meeting with the County Review Board, a routine but decisive step that signaled where the case now stood. Paperwork laid out in precise stacks, recommendations phrased with professional restraint. The conclusion, though softened by procedure, was clear. Without evidence of abduction, foul play, or verified sightings, the investigation could not remain active. It would transition into pending, a classification that amounted, in practice, to stillness. The Ridgway case, already 8 months old, entered the same category that afternoon. 2 children, same residential radius, same lack of direction, and for the first time, Ridgeton officially held 2 open disappearance files with no active leads. Families experience silence differently than investigators do. For the Ridgways, the first missing child, the uncertainty pressed against daily life in ways too subtle for reports to capture. Janet Ridgway avoided local grocery stores because she couldn't bear the rows of cereal boxes her daughter used to point at. Her husband stopped fixing the loose porch steps because the sound of the hammer echoed the afternoon the police had arrived. Their home remained neat, almost unnaturally so, as if order could disguise the widening absence inside it. The Rivers family coped differently. Danielle tried to structure her days with a pattern rigid enough to prevent thought from drifting. Morning chores, short walks, one set of phone calls to extended family. but nights remained unmanageable. She kept Evan's bedroom door half open, unwilling to disturb the toys he had arranged in his meticulous way, yet unable to bring herself to close the room off entirely. The house remained in a state that suggested he might return at any moment. His shoes stayed by the door. His drawings remained taped to the refrigerator. Nothing was moved, because moving anything felt too close to acceptance. As months turned into years, the cases entered a stage investigators quietly refer to as dim trails, periods in which tips arrive less frequently, but still often enough to require energy and attention. Mallory reviewed each lead with the steadiness of a man who refused to treat any possibility lightly. A traveler claimed she had seen a toddler resembling Evan at a rest stop 2 states away. The child turned out to be part of a family returning from vacation. A caller believed a neighbor kept a child hidden. It was a custody dispute. A reported sighting of a girl in a neighboring town briefly revived hope for the Ridgways, only to dissolve when DNA confirmed no connection. Still, something about the 2 disappearances clung to Mallory with persistent weight. When he looked at the maps, 2 markers within a 2-mile radius, identical windows of time, identical lack of noise, he found himself confronting a shape that did not align with typical abduction patterns. There was no escalation, no communication, no shift in method between the first incident and the second. If these were connected, the responsible party displayed none of the traits commonly found in serial or opportunistic offenders, and if they were not connected, the coincidence bordered on the mathematically improbable. Ridgeton adapted to uncertainty the way small towns often do, quietly, gradually, and with a determination to keep daily life moving. Residents locked their doors more consistently. They watched their children more closely. But after a year passed without new disappearances, the tension dulled into background caution rather than fear. By the time 5 years had elapsed, many newcomers to the town did not know that 2 toddlers had once vanished without a trace. They passed the courtyard without a second thought, unaware of the red truck that had sat untouched, or the way quiet mornings had once held a different meaning. The families, however, never crossed that line. The Ridgways lived with a form of waiting that could not be measured. The Rivers family kept every document, every search flyer, every update from the sheriff's office. Hope, for them, became something neither bright nor naive. It became a tone of persistence, a refusal to let memory decay simply because time insisted on moving forward. The official files remained open but unchanged. No arrests, no suspects, no confirmed sightings. The cold case designation, when it finally arrived, did not make headlines. It appeared only as a date on a form, another entry among records the county kept in storage. From that point on, the disappearances of Lily Ridgway and Evan Rivers lived in the quiet space that forms around unresolved cases. Always waiting, always present, but no longer occupying the center of public attention. And in that silence, an unanswered question lingered beneath the surface of both files. How does a child vanish in daylight, in a populated space, without anyone seeing the moment it happens? Years later, that question would finally collide with something that did not exist in 1993, technology capable of seeing patterns human eyes had missed. 2 decades after the disappearances, the Ridgeton files lived in storage more than in conversation. The county archive maintained them in identical gray folders, their pages softened by time and repeated handling. For years, no officer had added a note substantial enough to alter the trajectory of either case. The investigations weren't forgotten, but they were suspended, waiting for something that might never arrive. And yet, in the spring of 2019, long after the town had stopped expecting movement, an unexpected shift came from a direction no one in 1993 could have imagined: automated recognition technology. Deputy Frank Mallory had retired by then. though not in practice. He visited the sheriff's office often enough that younger deputies joked he had simply switched desks. His interest in the Ridgway and Rivers cases never diminished, but his options had always been limited by the same constraints: no suspects, no meaningful sightings, no forensic leads. When he first heard about a state initiative to digitize old missing persons files for potential cross-matching, he agreed only out of a sense of duty, not optimism. At his age, optimism belonged to the deputies who still believed every new tool might crack an old case. But digitization was not merely about scanning documents. The project involved uploading age-progressed photos into a statewide system linked to facial analysis algorithms. The software had been designed to address the hardest category of missing persons cases: those who vanished as children, leaving behind only young faces that no longer matched their adult appearance. It was not perfect. No machine could account for every nuance of aging, but it was capable of detecting continuities too subtle for the human eye. The Ridgway file went first. Lily Ridgway had been 2 years old when she disappeared, and the system processed her last known image through multiple predictive models. The results produced a set of possible adult likenesses, each slightly different in jaw shape, hair texture, and eye structure. The program ran these renderings against state records, then against other states participating in the pilot program. For weeks, nothing surfaced. Mallory treated the silence as expected, logging it without disappointment. He had trained himself to expect little. Then, shortly after midnight on a Tuesday in early July, the system flagged a partial match in Arizona. The probability score was not definitive. These tools never were, but it was high enough to require human review. The face belonged to a young man named Caleb Morey, arrested several months earlier for a minor traffic violation. The resemblance, when Mallory saw it on screen, was faint but persistent, carrying the kind of structural consistency the software was designed to detect. It wasn't the eyes or the expression, it was the underlying geometry, something that escaped emotional interpretation. The challenge with old missing person matches is that the first step is never to contact the person in question. Instead, protocol required verifying whether the possibility was even logistically feasible. Mallory examined every available detail from Caleb's record. Born in 1992, according to official documents. No adoption records. A childhood in foster care with a gap in documentation before age 5. The gap became the hinge point. It was long enough to obscure origins, short enough to be suspicious, and it mirrored patterns seen in other cases where identity had been altered, intentionally or otherwise. Mallory contacted the Arizona precinct listed on the report. The officer on duty confirmed something unusual. Caleb had no early medical files, no photographs from preschool years, and no living relatives who could speak to his infancy. He remembered only fragments: an apartment with green carpets, a swing set, a woman with a soft voice whose features he could never fully picture. The officer believed these recollections were simply childhood abstractions, the kind that blur into fiction. But Mallory recognized something else. The memories corresponded, roughly, imperfectly, to the Ridgway residence documented in 1993. Still, suspicion was not evidence. The next step required DNA. Getting it lawfully meant either voluntary consent or judicial approval. Mallory's request for a warrant went through review, where attorneys debated the line between technological possibility and legal justification. The court approved the request based on the unresolved nature of the Ridgway case and the consistency of the preliminary indicators. The sample arrived by secure mail 2 weeks later. The Ridgway family's DNA had been on file since the mid-90s. When the lab report came back, the answer was not ambiguous. The probability of biological relation exceeded 99.9%. The child who had vanished from a Ridgeton playground in 1993 had lived under a different name for more than 2 decades, unaware that his disappearance had altered the lives of 2 families. There was no celebration at the sheriff's office. Investigators, trained by experience, understood too well that solving a disappearance does not resolve the years that preceded it. What the match proved was biological truth, not emotional closure. But it also provided, for the first time, a point of origin for the second disappearance. If 2 events were separated by only 8 months, and one child had resurfaced alive under circumstances still unclear, then the possibility of a shared offender, long suspected, never proven, rose sharply. Mallory revisited his old notes with a different type of scrutiny. The lack of forced entry, the silent extraction, the vanishing scent trails, details once viewed as frustrating now demanded reinterpretation. If Lily had been taken and relocated rather than harmed, then Evan's case might share that pattern. But the absence of documentation for Caleb's early years raised another question. If someone had moved him across states without detection, what methods had they used? And why had they done it in the first place? The digital match changed the case from a static file into an active sequence. For the first time, investigators possessed a living individual linked to one of the disappearances. Caleb, formerly Lily, became not only a survivor, but a potential witness, even if his memories were fragmented. What the officers did not yet know was how closely the 2 cases were connected, nor how the second disappearance would respond to the same tools that had rediscovered the first. But the quiet certainty formed nevertheless. If technology had recovered one child after 26 years, it might be capable of illuminating the part of the story that remained missing. And the questions that had lingered for decades began to shift. From what happened? To where does the trail continue from here? The identification of Lily Ridgway under the name Caleb Morey did not close the file. It restructured it. Once the lab confirmed the biological match, investigators understood that the disappearance 8 months later, the unexplained vanishing of 4-year-old Evan Rivers, required immediate re-examination. The proximity in time, geography, and method had always suggested a connection, but now that one child had resurfaced alive, the framework of both cases changed. The question was no longer theoretical. Whoever had moved Lily across state lines without detection might have done the same to Evan. Detective Mallory, despite his retirement, remained involved as a consultant. His familiarity with the original scene helped bridge gaps between the 1993 investigation and the methods now available. The first task was technical. Repeat the entire facial analysis process using Evan's childhood photographs. The system processed more slowly this time. Evan had been older than Lily at the time of disappearance, which made prediction models more reliable, but future resemblance still varied widely. The software produced nearly a dozen potential adult projections. Analysts refined them and ran each through multiple databases: driver's licenses, arrest records, passport logs, school IDs in states participating in the system. For several weeks, the results offered nothing more than false positives. A man in Kansas resembled one projection, but had complete birth documentation. A young adult in Oregon looked similar, but was confirmed to be the biological son of his recorded parents. Investigators documented each possibility and ruled them out, following procedure rather than expectation. The break came not from the system, but from a small administrative anomaly flagged by an analyst reviewing the rejected matches. A profile in New Mexico had been initially dismissed because the listed date of birth suggested the individual was nearly 2 years older than Evan would have been. But when the analyst reviewed the record again, something stood out. The earliest documentation for that person, known as Aaron Wells, appeared abruptly when he was approximately 6 years old. Before that point, there were no hospital visits, no public school enrollment, no vaccination logs, and no identifiable guardianship filings. The gap was similar to the one found in Caleb's early life, though not identical in shape. What made it compelling was the date. The documentation began in late 1999, 6 years after the original disappearance. Mallory knew the difference between coincidence and pattern. The absence of an early childhood paper trail rarely occurred by accident. He requested photos from Wells's employment file, school records, and any publicly available sources. When placed alongside the predictive model generated from Evan's childhood face, the resemblance was stronger than with any previous match. Not proof, but direction. Contact with law enforcement in New Mexico brought an additional detail, one that shifted the tone of the inquiry. Wells, though cooperative during routine police interactions in the past, had always avoided questions about his childhood. Teachers recalled generic explanations, vague references to moving around with relatives. Neighbors remembered him as reluctant to discuss family. These descriptions were not unusual in themselves, but in the context of a missing person investigation, they gained weight. As with Caleb's case, DNA would be required. Investigators followed proper channels. Wells was approached during a standard community interview, legally unobtrusive, minimally invasive, and designed to avoid alarming individuals who might later prove uninvolved. He agreed to provide a swab, reportedly without suspicion, and the sample was forwarded to the laboratory handling the Ridgway match. The result arrived faster this time. The systems had already been calibrated to compare against the Rivers family profile collected decades earlier. When the confirmation came, it was unambiguous. The probability score aligned with that of a biological son. After 26 years, the boy who vanished from a driveway on an ordinary autumn morning was living under another name, unaware that his disappearance had shaped the lives of 2 families. Unlike Caleb, who carried faint impressions of his earliest home, Wells, now confirmed to be Evan Rivers, had no identifiable memories from before the age of 6. His earliest recollections were of a small desert town, a foster arrangement that later transitioned into informal guardianship, and a man whose presence appeared briefly and inconsistently. The man introduced himself under different names across different recollections, none of which could be verified. But when investigators compared these descriptions with notes from the 1993 interviews, a narrow convergence appeared. A tall adult male with a restrained manner, little interest in conversation, and a habit of avoiding administrative documentation. This figure, though still unnamed and unlocated, mirrored the profile tentatively assembled years earlier from witness statements near the Ridgway residence. A man seen lingering at a distance, whose features no one could describe well, whose presence never drew concern at the time. The pattern suggested method rather than impulse. It aligned with the conclusion that both children had been displaced deliberately, transported quietly, and placed in unrelated households without legal process. Once the biological confirmations were complete, the emotional dimension surfaced. A stage investigators could observe, but not direct. Families were notified with structured caution, ensuring no promises were made beyond what the evidence supported. The Ridgway and Rivers households reacted differently, but with equal gravity. Decades of uncertainty had conditioned them not toward relief, but toward careful processing, as if the news needed to be handled with the same precision as the investigation itself. In legal terms, the discoveries did not yield a suspect. The man described in both children's early memories and in older witness hints could not be identified through records. No fingerprints, no financial trail, no formal connection between any of the homes the children had passed through. The possibility that a facilitator of illegal adoptions had operated without leaving documentation became the leading theory. Still, theory could not be substituted for indictable evidence. Yet despite the limitations, The identification of Evan completed a cycle that had been open for 26 years. Two disappearances, 8 months apart, once viewed as isolated tragedies, were now understood as components of a concealed mechanism. What remained unanswered was intent, why the children had been taken, by whom specifically, and how the operation had evaded detection for so long. These questions would persist beyond the scope of a single investigation. But what the discoveries provided, beyond biological fact, was trajectory. The story no longer ended with absence. It continued with presence, documented and verifiable. And for families who had lived in suspended grief for decades, that shift alone altered the landscape of the case. The truth was not complete, but it had surfaced enough to reshape everything that preceded it. The identification of both missing children, first Lily, then Evan, forced the justice system to confront a reality that did not fit neatly into any established category. It is rare for a disappearance to be solved after more than 2 decades. Rarer still when 2 long, cold files converge without yielding a perpetrator. Although both cases had now produced living individuals whose identities had been altered, the narrative behind their relocations remained fragmented. For prosecutors, this created a legal environment defined as much by absence as by fact. The law requires a responsible party, a demonstrable action, and a clear chain of causality. Here, investigators possessed only outcomes. Local authorities convened a review panel to evaluate whether charges could be considered in relation to the unidentified man who had surfaced in multiple testimonies. The first challenge was definitional. Kidnapping charges generally require proof that a person was taken without consent and held through force, threat, or deception. In the Ridgway and Rivers files, the disappearance of the children met the conditions of unlawful removal. But the critical elements, identity of the situ offender, motive, and the specific circumstances of transport, were entirely missing. Without them, prosecutors could only state in formal language that a criminal act likely occurred, while being unable to identify the actor responsible. The second challenge stemmed from the conditions under which the children were later found. Lily, under the name Caleb, had grown up in a foster arrangement that appeared improvised rather than malicious. Evan, known as Aaron, had lived in a household without legal adoption paperwork, but without indications of physical harm. These environments, however irregular, were not linked to any known criminal network. No money trail, no forged documents leading to a single source, no communications linking the temporary caretakers to an organized operation. If a facilitator had orchestrated the placements, he had done so without leaving a discernible administrative footprint. These limitations shaped the official conclusion. The district attorney could not pursue charges without a suspect. The decision was procedural rather than emotional. It reflected the fundamental constraint of American law. Prosecution cannot proceed against a shadow, even when the shadow has disrupted 2 families for nearly 3 decades. The DA's written summary stated plainly that the individual known to have interacted with both children cannot be lawfully named, indicted, or brought to trial in absentia. For the families, this marked an unusual phase of closure. The law acknowledged wrongdoing, but it had no one to hold accountable. Nevertheless, investigators were not willing to leave the matter at a formal impasse. A parallel inquiry focused on constructing a working theory of the man who had appeared intermittently in both children's early recollections. The details were sparse. Some described him as tall, others as soft-spoken. No distinctive accent, no identifiable profession, no reliable clothing description. Composite sketches proved impractical. The memories derived from childhood impressions rather than concrete observations. The man existed in the case files like a faint watermark, present but indecipherable. Over time, Analysts assembled a hypothesis grounded in patterns commonly seen in unsanctioned child placement cases from the 1980s and 1990s. Such individuals often operated alone, motivated by ideology rather than profit, believing they were rescuing children from unstable homes or preventing perceived future harm. These actors rarely maintained contact with the families who later raised the children. Their goal was the transfer itself, not ongoing surveillance. While no evidence confirmed this model in the Ridgway Rivers case, its structure aligned with the absence of financial gain, lack of organized documentation, and the low visibility of the transfer. The FBI's behavioral unit reviewed the files and reached a similar conclusion. Their assessment suggested that the man may have been transient, socially isolated, and distrustful of institutions. He may have used names belonging to acquaintances or invented identities, which would explain why Victor Hale, the earliest name linked to a witness report in 1994, produced no verifiable records. Investigators could not determine whether the name was false, borrowed, or briefly used before being discarded. They only knew that the person behind it moved quietly, left no formal trail, and likely did not survive long into the 2000s. This final inference came from statistical modeling rather than evidence, but it remained the most credible explanation for why he had never re-emerged. With no offender to charge, the legal focus shifted back to the families. Identity restoration procedures began for both young adults, requiring careful documentation to merge current records with their birth identities. Courts authorized changes to Social Security profiles, amended birth certificates, and sealed prior custodial files to prevent confusion in future legal matters. These steps were administrative rather than punitive, but they marked the first time in 26 years that the law formally recognized both children under their original names. The families attended a judicial hearing for the final identity orders. The courtroom atmosphere was neither celebratory nor mournful. Rather, it reflected an understanding that the law could correct procedural inaccuracies, but could not reconstruct lost years. Judges, attorneys, and investigators approached the matter with the same restraint that characterized the entire reopened investigation. The outcome was not justice in the traditional sense, but an acknowledgement of truth. In the public record, the official conclusion remains concise. Both children were located alive. No credible suspect was identified. The cases are administratively closed but remain open to new information should it surface. The unnamed man, whoever he was, whatever his motive, exists only in recollection and inference. And although the law could not bring him into a courtroom, it had accomplished something else. It had reconstructed the broken lines of two families, placing the truth back into their hands after decades governed by uncertainty. What lingered, unspoken but understood by all involved, was a single question that resisted any attempt at conclusion. If someone could move two children across states without leaving a trace, how many other lives had intersected with his without ever being recognized? In the months following the court's confirmation of their identities, both families entered a period that could not be summarized by any single emotion. Reunion did not erase the 26 years that preceded it, nor did it resemble the dramatic reconciliation imagined by people who had never lived through uncertainty. Instead, the process unfolded quietly, shaped by caution and steady adjustment. Lily, still known publicly as Caleb, approached the transition with a kind of measured curiosity. He had built a life in Arizona, maintained friendships, and formed habits shaped not by the Ridgway home, but by the environment in which he grew up. Meeting his biological mother and siblings did not replace that foundation, but added another layer to it. The Ridgways, aware of the fragility of the situation, did not press for immediate closeness. Their initial meetings occurred in careful intervals, guided by therapists provided through a state reunification program. Conversations were pragmatic rather than nostalgic, centered on present stability more than on the past they could not recover. With time, Lily began visiting Ridgeton for short stays, not as a return to childhood, but as an introduction to a history he now understood belonged to him. Evan faced a different adjustment. His early memories were indistinct, and the Rivers family felt more unfamiliar to him than he to them. His adoptive environment, irregular though it had been, had given him a sense of continuity that the Rivers could not replicate. They approached him with deliberate patience. Instead of insisting on parental roles, they offered themselves as a source of information, connection, and medical history. Evan responded with a quiet steadiness that surprised investigators who had anticipated emotional volatility. What he sought was not restoration, but orientation: who he had been, where he came from, and what events had preceded his earliest memories. Both young adults declined to change their public names immediately. They were advised that identity, once reshaped by time, does not revert as easily as a legal document might suggest. What they accepted, instead, was the acknowledgement of origin, that the names they now carried were built upon foundations altered without their consent. For the families, this recognition held meaning independent of the legal system. It represented truth, finally documented after decades of speculation. The community of Ridgeton responded to the news with a mix of relief and restrained solemnity. Those who had participated in searches during the 1990s came forward with recollections shaded by age. Retired officers revisited their old case notes, grappling with the notion that both children had likely been moved out of the state within days of their disappearance. Residents who had raised their own children during that period spoke of the unease they remembered, but had never been able to articulate. Closure for them was not a celebration, but a recalibration of the past. Detective Mallory, whose persistence had anchored the modern investigation, returned to retirement with a more defined sense of completion. He did not frame the outcome as success in the traditional sense. There was no suspect in custody, no formal resolution to the question of criminal responsibility. But he recognized the significance of locating the children alive. In a field where outcomes often leaned toward loss, the recovery of two missing persons after 26 years stood as an exception. He kept copies of the final reports not as trophies, but as documentation that persistence, combined with advances in technology, could shift the trajectory of a case once considered immovable. As for the unidentified man, whether known as Victor Hale or any other name he may have used, his absence remained the only part of the case untouched by progress. Investigators could only theorize that he had operated alone, moved frequently, and possibly died without leaving records. The families understood that no definitive answer would likely emerge. The truth they received was substantial, yet incomplete, a reality common in long-term missing person cases. Time eventually softened the sharper edges of the discoveries. The families settled into new rhythms shaped by cautious connection. Holidays became blended arrangements, neither wholly familiar nor entirely dissonant. The young adults maintained communication through measured visits, phone calls, and shared documents about their medical histories. They built bridges slowly, aware that the story linking them was extraordinary, not for its drama, but for its improbability. What endured most strongly was a sense of restored orientation. Both families had spent decades navigating absence. Now, even without full explanations, they possessed knowledge that grounded their understanding of the past. The Rivers family resumed life without the constant question of whether they had missed a clue. The Ridgeways no longer speculated about distant possibilities, and though neither family could reclaim the years they had lost, They had reclaimed the certainty that those years existed. The community, too, carried something forward. When new missing person reports emerged, residents invoked the Ridgway and Rivers cases not as hope without foundation, but as examples of what long-term investigation could yield. Technology, intuition, and persistence formed a combination that might have been impossible decades earlier. But even in this landscape of partial restoration, one question remained unaddressed. Not in the files, nor in the interviews, nor in the final press statements issued by the sheriff's department. It was a question that belonged somewhere between closure and the unknown, a question that investigators themselves could not answer. If 2 children were moved quietly across states without leaving a trace, what assurance did anyone have that they were the only ones? The case concluded on paper, but the possibility that the man behind their disappearances had intersected other lives lingered, unresolved and unprovable, a silent reminder that some truths emerge only in fragments, leaving the rest to time. If you follow long, cold missing person cases and the search for truth hidden by decades, subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts below. In your view, what connects 2 disappearances separated by only 8 months? And why did the answers remain hidden